Welcome everyone to the fifth webinar in our series, the European City Network and Network of Towns series of webinars. For those of you who don't already know, the European Capital of Democracy is a non-profit organisation which was founded by the Innovation in Politics Institute. We're European-wide and we look to improve politics in collaboration with our network. We have offices in Vienna and Berlin and partners in over 20 European countries. So today, the topic of the webinar is growing up in poverty and looking at a trauma-sensitive approach. This webinar is hosted by the City of Antwerp with guest expert Ybe Casteleyn. So I think without any further ado, I will hand over to you, Ybe, and you can introduce yourself more fully.
It's lovely to see that many people interested in trauma-informed care. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to take you on a short trip on what trauma is and on what a trauma-informed society or trauma-informed care or also trauma-sensitive care is about. So I will do that as follows. I will share some theory about trauma and explain the basics of trauma-informed care. I will also demonstrate a technique when there is time for that by means of the trauma cards that you can use to talk with people more easily about trauma. Trauma is a very difficult matter to address, especially because we often fear doing so. We fear doing more harm than good while talking about it. So the trauma cards I will present you later on can help you discuss this toxic stress. That's what I call trauma tool, can help you discuss that in a more comfortable way. I am an avid advocate since long time of the trauma-informed society. I really believe that if we all know more about trauma, we could better help ourselves and also others. So that is why I think the basics of trauma should be really common knowledge for all of us, not only caretakers, but also teachers, parents, among friends. We should know about it. That is a bit, well, that is maybe my main message for today that I would like you to take along. And it is also the factor is also the reason that I wrote a book some years ago, 8 years ago, which was recently translated in English, The Healing Power of Pain. And I show it to you because the title really reflects what I believe about trauma. I believe that emotional pain can help us grow and can help us become the person we were meant to be, or we maybe deep down are, and lived us a more fulfilled life. I have to say my English is not perfect, so I'm nervous, but I hope it will pass in the next few minutes. So in the book, you'll find accessible theory on trauma, because it's a very short seminar. A lot of exercises also that you could use to regulate traumatic states, and also stories of traumatized clients in the process of recovering. So, but let us start now and take a short look at what trauma is. So the best known form of shock trauma, the best known form of trauma is shock trauma. For example, a car accident, an assault, war experiences. Shock trauma is in fact always the result of a life-threatening situation in adulthood. Symptoms of what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, are, for example, flashbacks, nightmares, a general state of anxiety or neurological alertness and arousal. And these symptoms are always, when it comes to shock trauma, related to the event itself. For example, after a car accident, you may feel very anxious or cry every time you think about the accident, or you may avoid driving again, or you may have flashbacks or even nightmares where you re-experience the accident as if it was happening to you again. The less well-known of trauma is complex trauma, and that's the core issue of today. Complex trauma or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a bit strange that complex trauma is less well known than shock trauma because it's much more common. Complex trauma is the result of chronic toxic stress in childhood. Toxic stress, for example, that goes along with what we call the big T's, big traumas, or ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, such as child abuse or neglect, sexual abuse, or also things like loss of a parent in childhood by death or divorce, or also by mental health problems, parents that are not really able to be parents anymore. So ACEs, what we call ACEs, are really incredibly common. 60% of us, of all of us, have at least one ACE, and 20% of us have at least 4 ACEs. But complex trauma can also be the result of less obvious traumas, which we call little T's. For example, growing up in poverty, or also having parents that are not really attuned into your needs as a child. So little T's are less palpable, but they're just as damaging. So complex trauma can be both. It can be the result of really bad and ugly things that happen to you in childhood, or it can be related to good things that you didn't get in childhood. And in fact, it's very common that it's a combination of these two, of both big T's and little T's. So, for example, we know that poor and less educated people tend to suffer from more ACEs than richer and higher educated people. Maybe just one thing to add to be clear on the terms I use. I use the term toxic stress as an overall term. Toxic stress and traumatic stress for me are the same. Extreme stress is the most important element in all sorts of trauma, be it PTSD, CPTSD, big T's, little T's, childhood stress, chronic abuse, etc. So it's a very short introduction on trauma, but we can talk more about it in the question section if you want to. I want to go a bit deeper. I want to talk a bit more about complex trauma because that's the most common. So let's talk a bit of that. There is, in fact, a lot of scientific evidence that especially complex trauma has a severe impact on the development of children, emotionally, mentally, and also biologically. On an emotional level, for example, people who suffer from complex trauma tend to be more dysregulated. They did not learn to regulate their inner emotional states. On a mental level, complex trauma clients show, for example, less self-worth. They think of themselves as bad or not good enough. And on a biological level, people with complex trauma are more vulnerable. It is proven that complex trauma contributes to many diseases later in life, such as chronic fatigue syndrome, cancer, cardiovascular problems, and so on. Complex trauma also impacts what we call our sense of self and our sense of belonging. That's the way we feel about ourselves, or who we think we are, or how we relate to others in the world. Indeed, the word complex refers to the complexity of chronic childhood trauma. The child's development and the child's trauma become intertwined. It becomes difficult to differentiate between what in the child and later in adulthood is the effect of or the result of trauma and what is not. So let's take a look now at our trauma responses and the so-called survival mechanisms. What are they about? PTSD and CPTSD have that in common. In the moment of trauma itself, and later on, when triggered, we feel overwhelmed. That is the toxic in toxic stress, the overwhelming aspect of it. It is too much for us. And it is also too much for our nervous system. We lose our ability to cope well with the situation and fall back into instinctive responses, instinctive reactions, the so-called Fs, fight, flight, and freeze. The Fs are biological. The Fs are automatic, instinctive responses to overwhelming stress. For example, not wanting to drive anymore after an accident is a flight response, or hiding at home after an assault, or not daring to go out anymore. A PTSD flight, I said that already, is always, and also the other Fs that goes along with PTSD, are always clearly related to the traumatic event, not so a CPTSD-F. For example, if as a child you regularly overheard your parents arguing and fighting, you may become very good in conflict avoidant behavior. Change the subject, say something funny, or step out of the room when a conflict in your context is arising. Such behavior is also called a flight. But you may not be clearly aware that it is connected to what happened to you as a child. You may even be fully unaware of the fact that you are in a survival mode. You may think that your conflict avoidant behavior, for example, belongs to you, that it is part of your personality or part of your character. So as we grow up, the Fs we relied on as a child can take many, many different forms. For example, aggressive behavior whenever you feel threatened, people pleasing to feel more safe and validated, or perfectionism to try to do at least some things in your life well. Survival modes are, especially when they come with complex trauma, ways to avoid being hurt again. And this avoidance is really problematic because we know for sure that staying stuck in avoidant behavior does not help us heal from the past. So to regain control, we need to be aware of our response to toxic stress and to be able to regulate that response in triggering situations. And that is exactly where trauma-informed care comes in, helping people become aware and understand their reactions to stressful situations, especially in complex trauma settings where the link between what happened then and what happens now, or what happened yesterday and what happens today, is not clear, not obvious. CPTSD clients may in fact have to re-educate, even reinvent themselves to heal. They need to get rid of old survival behavior and install new coping mechanisms, new ways of relating to themselves and to others, healthier ways, ways that fit more with the person you deep down are or want to be. Trauma-informed care helps them getting there, and I think that is what we as caretakers really aim to make a difference, a good and lasting difference in persons' lives. So what is that trauma-informed care or trauma-sensitive care? Well, the first thing to do is psychoeducate the people you work with. Help them realize how widespread trauma is and that they may suffer from it too. To understand one's own feelings and behavior is the very first step in every healing process. Recognizing signs of toxic stress is next. For example, becoming aware of a trigger or a fight or flight reaction or other avoidant behavior. Only then, after recognizing the state one is in, is it possible to try to respond differently, more appropriate to the present context, instead of repeating automatic reactions to a past event. If both caretaker and client are able to go through these first 3 steps, re-traumatization will not occur. Instead, regulation will set in, and with that, little by little, healing. So, trauma-informed care is about helping people to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Survival mechanisms like the Fs are very normal and very meaningful, but mostly only in the traumatic situation itself. Afterwards, we need to replace them by healthy coping mechanisms, and healthy coping mechanisms are chosen reactions in line with the present context and in line with our needs and values. So, how to work trauma informed? Well, in the first place, working trauma informed means to dare to have meaningful conversations. It means not being afraid to talk about toxic stress and our reactions to it. It means to dare to address stress-driven reactions instead of avoiding or even worse, judging them. And once our stress pattern is more clear, of course, to search for alternative behavior we can be more satisfied or even proud of. That is what growing through pain means. Pause with the pain, explore it, and then be able to handle it better. We can only influence what we are aware of. So, to help you facilitate such stress exploring conversations with clients or other persons in your life, I developed a set of trauma cards. So let's now get into the second, more practical part of this webinar, psychological education by means of the trauma cards. Of course, there are many other means and tools for psychoeducation, but this one works good for me and other colleagues. I always have these cards in reach at my office, and I take them with me when working on site. As I've learned through the years, psychoeducation is not an easy thing. Psychological theories and concepts can be complicated to explain and very dull to listen to. Using pictures, as with the trauma cards or other resources, is very helpful and more interactive. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It really is. And also for the client, looking together at something, an illustration, for example, feels much safer than being watched at all the time during a conversation. As you can see on the slide, the set of cards is divided into 4 categories: facts or theory about traumatic stress, symptoms of toxic stress, interventions for the caretaker, and exercises that clients can learn or the persons can learn to regulate themselves. It is hopefully clear that the 4 categories collide with the 4 steps of trauma-informed care we just talked about. Now, how do I use the cards? I will show them to you in a minute. The easiest way is just to put them on the table and start a conversation, period. That's a very open and easy way to use them. You can also, of course, pick 1 or 2 or 3 cards yourself in function of what you want to discuss, for example, with a family or with a group of persons. Another way, a way I use a lot, and which is much more interactive, is and is also maybe more suitable for groups or families, is to let every person of a group choose 1 card and then ask them to talk about the card they chose with the following 3 questions in mind. I will explain that a little. So the first question would then be, why did you choose this card? This is a very interesting question because people tend to choose a card for personal reasons. They feel attracted to it because it reflects something of their own experience, for example. So the answer on this first question may give you some vital personal information or install a more personal, authentic contact. Next question. Sorry. Next question, what is the card about? Is about exploring the meaning of the card. So this is the moment where psychoeducation comes in. We do it in form of a question because that gives people the opportunity to bring in their own experience and knowledge. Sharing knowledge is a much more pleasant way and also a much more empowering way to learn about things than just listening to the expertise of somebody else. So this question is about bringing knowledge in. The third question you could use, can you give an example of what you see? So this question helps exploring the card on a more practical level. How does the card applies to you or to your situation? What is the message, for example, you want to take with you from this conversation? Could also be explored by this question. So there are only 3 ways to use the cards. I'd like to encourage you to take a more closer look at the cards, maybe after the webinar, and then to implement them, if you wish, in the way you already work and talk with people. So to make them your own is maybe the best way to use them. Let us talk about the cards themselves now. What we see here is card number 1. In the left upper corner is written fact number 1. So this is a theory card. What the card illustrates is the overwhelming aspect of traumatic stress or toxic stress. Another important message of this card you could discuss is that trauma is an experience. It's not an event. Trauma lies not in the event itself, but in how we experience that event. So the wave can represent a past event, but it can also represent a trigger. The wave may be not life-threatening in itself, the event, but you can tell by the look on the person's face that it does feel like that. the experience. You could also use this card to explain what regulation is. It makes a huge difference whether a person is a child or an adult, whether a person is provided with a boat, a lifeline, or even a surfboard, a resource, whether a person can swim or not. So this card shows you that regulation means finding ways to ride the emotional wave. Theory card number 2. This card gives you the opportunity to discuss what we discussed before, or survival modes, fight, flight, and freeze. Think of youngsters feeling angry all the time or getting aggressive to cover up their feeling of helplessness. They function in fight. Or think of a stressed out mother who yells at her children regularly. That's a fight too. So these were the first 2 cards in the theory category. I will not discuss all of them because we have not enough time. This is just to give you an impression. These are the symptom cards. Again, 5 cards. I will maybe go into more detail for 2 of them. Do I still have time, Laura? 5 minutes. Okay, maybe one of them then. This card, for example, symptom card number 3, I use this to explain the triune brain. As you all know, our brain is divided in 3 parts. The human or rational brain, which is here in the front, the limbic system in the middle, and the reptilian or survival brain deep down under here. That is the part that you see in blue on the card. When in survival mode, we do not choose our behavior. Our reptilian brain does. So knowing this can help your client better understand himself, being milder with him or herself, or even overcome shame. For example, the mother who yells at her children when feeling stressed, knowing she does that when overwhelmed and not really capable of consciously choose her reaction, may give her some space, this knowing, and maybe just enough space to try to do something else when stressed again. Somatization, that's also a symptom card number 4. Somatization means emotional pain that manifests itself in the body, for example, as a disease. Many traumatized people suffer from diseases. Trauma, especially chronic childhood trauma, we know that, deeply upsets our nervous system and our natural inner rhythms, such as sleep, digestion, blood circulation, way of breathing, and so forth, and thus lie at the heart of all so-called stress diseases. So using this card makes it more easy to discuss matters like that. These are the intervention cards, interesting for the helpers among us. I'll discuss maybe one of them. Yeah, let's take this one. So this card touches the very heart of trauma-informed care, psychological education, understanding what is happening to us and to be able to help oneself is very, very empowering. Traumatized people often have thoughts about being normal. So correct information about the effects of big and little T's on our inner world are really vital. It's crucial. I remember very well the first time I was educated about stress. As a youngster, I was very, very angry. I still am sometimes. But as a youngster, I had problems controlling this anger. I regularly, for example, had outbursts towards my parents. So I remember the day a school teacher helped me to better understand my family dynamics. And at that moment, I felt better. I felt instantly better about myself because I certainly understood that I was not crazy myself, maybe, but maybe my parents were, or maybe the way we communicated or argued in our family was. So to understand things like that as a youngster or later on in life can be life-changing, very empowering. For me, it meant the world. It was maybe the first time in my life I felt like a normal person, a worthy person. Have we still time for another card, Laura? Can I do another one?
Yeah, we have 2 minutes to wrap it up and then we can move on to the questions.
Okay, I'll skip that one about regulation and I'll choose an exercise card. Breathing from the belly, exercise card number 2. Working with the breath is essential when you work trauma-informed, because working with the breath is a very effective way to help calm down the nervous system on the moment itself. Just asking people to calm down does not work very well. Saying, for example, please calm down, there's no need to get angry over that, is not helpful. In fact, prompts like that tend to push people even further, even deeper in their overwhelmed state when triggered. It is much more helpful to help people regulate their breathing and to say, for example, I can see that you're angry, I understand, but I also see that your breathing is very heavy. So shall I help you get your breathing under control? Would be an intervention that goes with this card, and then you give a breathing exercise or you learn it. So belly breathing makes us feel very comfortable and safe. It regulates our inner rhythms too. So that is what we want our clients to be able to do. To get there, we need to take a normal breath, not too deep, a normal breath, and thicken our belly with it, and then exhale very slowly till our belly is flat again. That is very difficult for some people. In that way, when we do that like that, we do not inhale too much oxygen, which is very activating. And while we breathe out, our muscles relax. So the first rule when giving breathing exercises is to focus on the exhalation. So would like to say just one other thing about breathing. There are 3 kinds of breathing. The belly breathing we all know is relaxing, but there are 2 other kinds of breathing that are specifically related to the fight and flight response or to the freeze response. So the breathing associated with the fight and flight response is a very heavy breathing, pretty loud also, even grummy sometimes. You can detect it by its noise and by observing the chest of the person you're looking at going heavily up and down. So it goes a bit like this. It is the breathing that comes along with anger or also with hysterical crying. This breathing prepares you to fight or flight danger. It's not relaxing at all. It shows your client's activation, its arousal. So it is good to give clients like that exercises for belly breathing. The breathing associated with the freeze response is another one. It's a very shallow one. You can barely hear it, you can barely see it, and it takes place in the throat. It goes like this. So you didn't hear it. When a person is breathing that shallow, he or she is in fact in great fear and maybe on the verge of dissociation or collapse. And to go from this sort of briefing to belly briefing is very difficult, nearly impossible. You need to pass by the fight or flight briefing first. You need to go from belly breathing to a more activated breath and then slow down to belly breathing. You cannot skip this part. So 3 different kinds of breathing associated with different stress responses and in consequence, different ways to regulate breath and with breath, the nervous system. So that's just one example of an exercise card. I think I have to stop and go to the question section. Let me maybe tell you that you can find, if you would like to work with the trauma cards, you can find them on my website, and they come along with a booklet with plenty of information on the meaning of the cards.
Ybe, thank you so much for that very brief presentation on what is obviously a huge topic. And I know you only touched on quite a few aspects of it. Our city network itself is made up of 21 cities across 13 countries. Barcelona is the current European capital of democracy, and they will hand over to Vienna later on this year, who will be the next European capital of democracy. So this Network of Towns project is co-funded by the European Union, and it's made up of a consortium including Antwerp, Barcelona, Bologna, Braga, Brussels, and Cascais. And together we have developed this series of webinars, and we also have in-person meetings among the consortium.